Welcome everyone to the WSR 2021-2022 WSR certificate conferral. My name is Dr. Ashley Bacchi, and I am the WSR faculty chair for this year. And I'd like to first just quickly introduce the program if you are not already aware of it. So this program is a certificate program for enrolled GTU students who wish to integrate an intentional focus on women's studies in interreligious dialogue, theology, and religion. And it encourages the work of our faculty and students here at the GTU. This year, we've had a very vibrant event series called WSR Speaks. So I do hope that you'll check out our website at wsr.edu. It's www.gtu.edu/WSR, sorry. And from there, you can get the link to our YouTube list. This event will also be added to that. So there were 6 WSR Speaks events this year, and it was a very vibrant dialogue. So we hope that those can be resources that can be used for anyone that's interested in women's studies and religion. And we hope to continue those discussions. Today, we are here to celebrate 2 of our students. Becca Bernard, who is a MDiv student at Star King, and Barbara Ann Cozy, a JST MDiv student. And so I'm going to invite each of them to share about their work and what this certificate is for them, has meant for them. And then after we do that, we will be having the WSR faculty chair lecture. And at the end of the lecture, we'll have some time for group discussion. So I will invite first Barbara Ann Cozy to share her views on WSR and what it's meant to her and her program.
Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I am like at an outdoor space, so it might be a little bit loud. I apologize for that. But I am a 3rd-year Master of Divinity student at Jesuit School of Theology. I'm working within the Catholic tradition, and after I finish my program at JST, I'll be headed on to do a PhD in ethics with Boston College, Department of Theology. And my research interests are a lot around issues of gender and sexuality. I identify as queer, and so a lot of my final papers and like thoughts and research in general has been kind of at this intersection of like the tension that a lot of queer and specifically queer women sit at within the Catholic tradition. And I've really appreciated my GTU classes, the women's seminar class that we have attached to this certificate, as well as some of my other classes that kind of have like worked around queer themes and like the ways in which they've shaped myself throughout my time at the GTU. So yeah, that's kind of like the certificate is very salient to me in terms of what I do research-wise, as well as like pastorally. And I'm looking forward to kind of continuing some of these themes in my doctoral program next fall. So yes, I'm very thankful for this program, for Dr. Bacchi, and for the Women's Studies and Religion program in general. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much for sharing. And now can I have Rebecca share with us?
Hi, I'm having a hard time hearing. The sound is cutting in and out, so I don't actually know if you all can hear or see me. But please tell me in the chat if I'm not coming through. Okay, great. So my name is Becca Bernard. My pronouns are she, her. I live on Dena'ina Athabascan lands up here in Anchorage, Alaska. And like Dr. Bacchi just said, I am completing my MDiv at Star King School for the Ministry. Just real briefly, my story is that I was an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I studied religion and women's studies, and but then went on to have a environmental law career for about 20 years. And after 20 years of that, I just really felt the need for a shift in direction, and so enrolled in divinity school so that I could find a more holistic and spiritually grounded approach to the work of social change, away from the system of domination and exploitation that we live in, toward a system that's more based on care. And so the Women's Studies in Religion program has been a really important part of my studies. And I'm just going to name three of the classes that were especially important to me. Inez Radson's Women's Studies in Religion seminar gave me an opportunity to do a deep dive into motherhood theory, which as a mother was a really fascinating study for me. I took a Latina Mujerista theology course with Dr. Sofia Betancourt, which was really fantastic, and a Black Lives Matter course with a visiting professor, which helped me to see that the issues of police brutality and other issues that Black Lives Matter, the movement, has been facing really involve women too, more than we hear about in the news. So really the program just helped me to integrate different strands of thought for myself and different issues that I care a lot about, issues affecting women, families, BIPOC people, the earth, and how these are all interrelated in the systems of domination that we live in. And also, which we of course we're clearly seeing now with the leaked draft decision from the Supreme Court. And the program and the coursework that I did also really, for me, helped show the importance of inter-issue and interfaith coalition building, and of continuing to mobilize people of faith, of all different faiths, to counter the religious right. And so those are things that I hope to carry forward in my ministry and ministries in the path ahead. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you. We are so proud to have you as graduates of our certificate. Your work, we hope that you will stay in contact with us as you further develop your projects and as you go on in your path, so we can highlight any of your achievements and the achievements that you've already accomplished. So I want to first mention that the WSR certificate, the core course, the WSR seminar, is offered every year, and it has different instructors every year. So next year it'll be a new hall with 2 of our WSR steering committee students, and it has a different focus every year and resources. So I do hope that if you're interested in the certificate, that you will enroll next year. So we're going to move into the faculty chair portion. If you have any questions as the lecture is going on, you can put them in the chat and we'll address them, or I'll address them at the end. And yes, so I'm going to ask Deandra to share the PowerPoint that I sent. Thank you. All right, so sorry, I'm having my computer's freezing for a second. Okay, sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties with my computer. One moment. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so the Title of my lecture for today is Welcoming Experience, Passion, and Vulnerability, a Pedagogy of Flipped Scripts. So today I'm going to introduce a pedagogical process that I teach in my graduate students at the GTU and Star King, called Flipping the Script, which invites them to bring their experience, passion, and vulnerability to the classroom and the research. I do have to admit that the plan for this lecture changed after the leaking of the draft for the Supreme Court decision to repeal Roe versus Wade. I asked my students how they will use platforms and the power that they hold in their communities when they have it. So I have to practice what I teach and use this platform to educate, to counter oppressions as we face the potential loss of rights justified in large part by the manipulation of sacred texts and traditions. So I will first introduce my framework as an intersectional feminist and personal story, and then the first 4 steps that I introduced to my students for flipping a script, and then we'll dive into it. I'd like to issue a trauma warning and know that this lecture will discuss abortion, miscarriage, systemic racism, and its connections to other systems of oppression. As I mentioned, will take questions at the end, and you can put your questions in the chat during the lecture if you wish, and I'll address those first. Next slide. So first, I identify as an intersectional feminist. Feminism has its own history of oppression. Critical race theory began in the 1970s in legal discourse as a method of processing and explaining how the advances made during the civil rights movement were already being lost, because white supremacy is not about discrimination of individuals. It's a complex system of oppression that is embedded within American culture. Postcolonial studies as a field of study was also gaining ground in the late 1970s, especially with Edward Said's Orientalism, which came out in 1978. By the end of the second wave, it became clear that feminism was more reflective of white, middle-class, Western American women's experience. Critical race theory and postcolonial theory offered critical frameworks, and by the 1980s, pioneers such as Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza had already paved the way for the burgeoning of womanist, mujerista, postcolonial, queer, and liberationist theologies focused on women's experience, which represent a wide range of views that raise the voices of people of color, as well as other marginalized communities in sacred text interpretation and spirituality that have been traditionally marginalized, if not completely silenced and absent. Third wave feminisms strive to be critical and acknowledge their own structural racism and colonial mindsets. Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor of law, was the first to frame the model of intersectionality in relation to axes of discrimination in 1989. And the concept captured the essence of what third wave feminist hermeneutics wish to acknowledge and center. An intersectional feminist hermeneutic focuses on the ways in which people simultaneously hold a variety of identities, each of which is an integral part of them. But depending on the context, one or more aspects may be brought to center. The different elements of our identity impact the way in which they move within our cultural context and how that cultural context responds to us. It focuses on relationships between categories, on the process of differentiation, and how exclusions and boundaries are formed rather than the boundaries or restrictions themselves, as well as investigating the cultural systems that have been created to support or oppress those identities. Third wave feminisms acknowledge the intersectionality of lived experience and open space for discussion of how ethnicity, class, sexuality, disability, nationality, and religion are just some of the lenses that affect how we see and experience gender. That is not to say that there is still not racism or colonialism within feminist movements that are around today and now. Awareness and decentering privilege is a constant and ongoing process, and people within movements need to be committed to ongoing growth. Your intersectional identity impacts what you are drawn to in readings and lectures. And students encouraging students to see the connections and disjunctions by pulling from their own experience and seeing what they pull out from the readings and lectures leads to questions that will open up discussion and add depth to our courses. Before I can expect my students to be vulnerable, I have to model that by being vulnerable myself. And I often do this right in the beginning of a seminar class. So I will discuss some of my aspects of my intersectional identity. For today's focus, I would like to discuss why reproductive rights are so important to me and share an experience that I've had that highlights the intersectionality of these issues and as well as privilege. This is not something that I've ever talked about publicly before, but I experienced a miscarriage a few years ago now, and it was a traumatic experience. You know, although miscarriages are very common, about 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage, according to the Mayo Clinic. It's still taboo to discuss in most cases, and it's difficult. According to my medical record now, because I've had a miscarriage that's labeled as a spontaneous abortion. That is the medical term for a miscarriage. I am living in California, which is looked at as one of the safe haven states for if what has been leaked in the draft Supreme Court ruling, California would be one of the places that's seen as a safe haven to come. At the time of my miscarriage was, I live in Northern California in an area that has, doesn't have great healthcare. And although my personal gynecologist, my doctor, is not part of, is part of a small clinic, was part of a small clinic, she didn't have access to a operating room, and I needed a DNC after there were complications after the miscarriage. And the only operating rooms that were available were through the Catholic hospital system. And the process of, I was unable to get an operating room. And I'm not going to go into details, but it dragged on from 2 months of mine being denied the medical care that I needed. And even though I have the privilege of having insurance, being white, cisgendered, married, although I do not have my partner's last name. I'm married to a cisgendered male. Although having a wonderful doctor that was advocating to me for my with my insurance companies, I was still treated to through that hospital system as one that was attempting to, in the course of trying to get a DNC, as if I was attempting an abortion, even though I was no longer pregnant. And this is in California. I was subjected to unnecessary internal ultrasounds on multiple occasions, even after I had already was no longer pregnant. So the reason that this is so important to me is because it was important to me before my experience. But after and during my experience, I was thinking to myself of how, if even with all of my privileges that I brought to the situation, the way I was treated, and again, and also the privileged place of where I live, this is my experience. and how awful and traumatic it was for me. My capacity for empathy and understanding for those that have to go through the horrible experience of going for an abortion. My feeling of empathy expanded in ways that I didn't know was possible. And so I do call those, as again, it's so common for so many pregnancies to end in miscarriage. I do call for those who have experienced that to think about that pain and to tap into that, to become allies in thinking about this reproductive justice battle that we are about to re-enter. So I am going to, that is my experience and vulnerability that I bring to now what I will be discussing as my flipped script. And I'm hopefully going to show how this is not a single issue. As the civil rights activist Audre Lorde, a self-described Black lesbian mother warrior poet, stated, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." So my hope is that this will open up discussion that will fuel action for active listening to one another and for transformation and change, for greater empathy and yes. So next slide, please. So I strive in my research and in my teaching to fall into the following definition of feminist work. And I would like to note that I follow Elizabeth Schussler's Fiorenza's spelling and intention behind women, contextualized here as women with a slash between the W-O/MEN, seeks to underscore not only the ambiguous character of what the terms woman and women, but also to retain the expression women as a socio-political category, since the traditional rendering is often read as referring to white women only. My unorthodox writing of the word seeks to draw attention of readers that those hierarchical structures which determine women's lives and status also in fact impact those of men of subordinated race, class, country, and religion, albeit in different ways. Women is therefore to be understood as an inclusive rather than an exclusive universalized gender term. So it's a quote from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. And the following working definition of feminist work was put forth at the Society of Biblical Literature annual meeting in 2010. Feminist work must challenge, destabilize, subvert the subordination of women rather than strengthen or reinforce it. Feminist work must reflect appreciation of and respect for women's experience by acknowledging women's capacities and agency. Women's work must be sensitive to context, both the immediate and possibly the larger context as well. Feminist work must be critical of the manner in which women have both aided and resisted oppression, subjugation, and violence. Feminist work must have as a consequence far-reaching changes in religion and society, as well as political and revolutionary significance. Hence, it must be practical, this worldly, transformative, renewing, and transitional. Next slide. In order to employ this type of feminist work in my classes, especially those that engage with sacred texts, I empower my students to flip the script on oppressive interpretations and traditions. The Latin contexto refers to tying, connecting, weaving together. In creating context, we want to weave together as many resources as possible. So these steps for flipping a script, again, they don't have to be in this order, but these are the first four that I suggest students kind of focus on to begin. One is acknowledgement. So decentering yourself to see how the text or tradition or reading may be marginalizing or supporting the oppression or dehumanization of a range of people, for example, based on gender identification, sexual preference, disability, social economic standing, etc. If this text or tradition is familiar to you, this requires approaching it mindfully, separating what you have been taught to understand it to mean and thinking about it as if it is new. Often problematic readings or traditions are not acknowledged as problematic. So those that are not impacted by it walk away subconsciously reinforced with oppressive content. And those that feel targeted by the text are left feeling they are not accepted, loved, or protected. Acknowledging rather than ignoring the problem is the first step to unpacking its oppressive potential. Literary context. Sacred texts are often introduced in segments, fragments of a narrative that are not contextualized. Reading the full arc of the narrative before and after a quote or segment that has been used to support and sustain oppressive structures and contextualizing the characters that events often alleviates some of the broad sweeping generalizations that have been made that misrepresent the meaning of the text. Next slide, please. Historical cultural context. We need to remember that the ancient world you are delving into, for instance, looking at the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures, or in the reception of those texts within Jewish and early Christian and church father history, is different than our own. The different historical context brings with it its own set of norms, which means if sacred texts are to be used as a model for behavior, they need to be translated to a correlating model. This is often not done, so modern preconceptions of what is being referred to as proper or normal or natural behavior is often misaligned. Understanding this different world view and its customs help students unpack how they can start to adapt the understandings of certain sacred texts to current situations and circumstances. What has been presented as clear-cut prohibitions or power structures are not applicable to the communities they have often been levied against today. There is no one-to-one ratio with the ancient world and the modern one. But by understanding the proper historical cultural context, we can often destabilize the ways texts and traditions have been received, resulting in a wider range for counter oppressive readings. And for reclaiming the voice of the marginalized. So the ancient world is different from our own, but one thing that is similar today and that is often hidden is its diversity of religion, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. This diversity has often been silenced. One step in flipping the script and creating counter-oppressive readings is to shift focus from the dominant figures of the text and lift up those that are in the background. What are they saying and doing? Next slide, please. So a strong flip script identifies the oppressive script at play. It asks what definitions and justifications are being put forward to support and sustain it, and then research the context of the issue. For this flip script, I will focus on changing perceptions of personhood and the religious and political foundations of the abortion debate. We'll explore this debate over personhood from theological and legal platforms. So who is this presented as impacting and who is being ignored and silenced? When does life begin? Who decides that? Does that stance reflect the religious traditions it claims to? I will address the problem with pro-life and pro-choice, the pro-life, pro-choice dichotomy for people of faith and proposals for moving beyond it, and a call for allyship, and understanding the intersectional aspects of the issue and the potential intersectional repercussions with the loss of rights from the repeal of Roe v. Wade. I do suggest, I'll have some suggestions of articles that will be placed in the PowerPoint at various points. And so please, if you're watching it later, then you can pause and also see about adding a handout that has these resources available. Next slide, please. First, let's clarify that birthing people are not all cisgendered females, and people are not defined by their reproductive abilities or decisions. There are people that are unable to physically bear children. They can still be parents through a variety of paths. They are not any less of a parent than any other. There are people that can, but do not want to have children, and they are not incomplete for not doing so. And there are those that may be in a variety of circumstances which do not allow them to have a choice about whether to proceed with a pregnancy, because it would be dangerous to their health. It would be financially unstable to support a child. They could potentially lose their jobs. They could be in an abusive relationship or experiencing a variety of other combination of factors that make the prospect of carrying a fetus for several months not only untenable, but dangerous to their physical and psychological well-being. Next slide, please. Abortion is an extremely divisive issue. It is simultaneously very personal, as well as the object of national and international discussion. Reproductive rights are not just a women's issue. It is an intersectional debate intricately connected with class, race, gender, and sexuality. This lecture is meant to try to disentangle how arguments developed, because the debate between pro-life and pro-choice has become so polarized that many accept without critical reflection the taglines presenting a dichotomy that is anything but clean-cut. This dichotomy has allowed one side to co-opt their claims in religious, moral, and ethical terms that are presented as if those claims are absolute and reflective of what is, quote unquote, natural, traditional, and normal, while the other side is associated with secular or legalistic claims. And the majority of time, this camp does not fight the stigma that the quote unquote religious high ground is against them, which sustains the internal schisms for people of faith that identify as pro-choice. The question is, when did this concept of what is quote unquote natural or traditional get decided, and by who? Are these arguments rooted in the Hebrew Bible and or Christian scriptures, or in received tradition? Are they claims rooted in scripture and tradition that counter this particular dominant religious, moral, ethical stance taken by the pro-life movement? And is this issue, if this issue is too complicated to be dissolved into a simple dichotomy between pro-life and pro-choice, because the situations we face as individuals and as a society are not simple, and there are repercussions to any path taken. We need to be able to challenge the myths that have been allowed to flourish unchecked, so that we can engage with one another, finding out what the root of the issue is for us personally. We have to be open to questioning critically the definitions and structures that have been set in order to open space for dialogue that will actually address the variety of concerns this poses for all sides in a way that moves past accusation and scapegoating and allows us to find ways to acknowledge each other's pain while not imposing our values on others, which means recentering on every individual's right to bodily autonomy. Next slide, please. The first step is in disentangling scripture from tradition, to see these on their own and where they stand, is confronting what is perceived or believed to be there and seeing if it is actually in the sacred text. This frees people of faith from being restricted to a particular interpretation and allows for a more nuanced discussion on what the overall call of scripture is, namely a call to support the most marginalized and oppressed and to love thy neighbor as thyself. This framework shifts the argument from judgment and condemnation to a discussion that has the capacity to hold the intersectionality of oppressions in this issue, that as it opens up space for deeper discussion of the identity of who we see as the most marginalized and weak that are in need of protection. Who are we called to care for, empathize with, support, and why? People do not claim their justification for judgment, oppression, and violence, that it's rooted in a particular tradition or interpretation. Rather, they claim to have secret authority. For example, it's not my church says you're wrong, but the Bible tells me you're wrong. So what does the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures actually say about abortion? Nothing. The typical verses used from these sacred texts to support the violence against and vilification of those who face this difficult decision are the following: Genesis 9, Exodus 21, Psalm 139, Isaiah 44, Deuteronomy 30, Jeremiah 1, 4, and 5. The most direct of these citations is Exodus 21, 22, which we'll discuss in the next slide. But what is important to note here is that these citations refer to three categories. 1, procreation based in the need to populate an empty earth. 2, general prohibitions against killing, which is transgressed and justified in a variety of scenarios. So a focus on the command to not take a life comes down to whose life gets prioritized. And 3, verses that are taken out of their literary context that is focused on the issue of idolatry to try to substantiate a particular view on when life and personhood begins. What is noteworthy is that there are many descriptions of approved and disapproved behaviors in both the Hebrew Bible and Christian scriptures, and in places that it would fit the literary and thematic context to discuss the issue of abortion, the issue is not discussed. For example, in Paul's letter to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 5, 6, and 7, Paul specifies sexual immorality he sees in the church, which he includes as adultery, incest, and sex with prostitutes, but he makes no mention of abortion. Abortion and infanticide were common practices all across the Mediterranean, the ancient Mediterranean, which was context of the both of the Hebrew Bible, as the ancient Mediterranean includes Northern Africa and the Near East. And so this silence is deafening. Next slide, please. So in exploring the literary context, we have to address issues of translation. So we'll start at the core of the issue that sometimes has been obscured in modern debates. The core is our understanding of when life begins and life's connection with the soul. And this is, we can focus on Exodus 21, 22, which helps determine the boundaries of Nefesh Adam, and Leviticus 24, 17. This is the story where there is laws, excuse me. So Exodus 21, 22 describes a scenario where a pregnant woman is caught in the middle of a fight. If she miscarries, but she is unharmed, then the person at fault has to pay a fine. But if the woman is killed, then they have to pay a life for a life. So laws against taking a life in the Torah, as noted in Exodus 21:12 and Leviticus 24:17, refer to the killing of a person, an ish, or a nefesh adam. This is understood to include a newborn as soon as its head is out of the mother's body, but a fetus in the womb is a lav nefesh hu, and not a person. The Palestinian Talmud and halakhic views have interpreted this as a justification for the practice of therapeutic abortion. Therapeutic abortion means for the purpose of the health and safety of the mother. Jewish tradition prioritizes the mother's life over the unborn fetus, which again is exemplified in Exodus 21, 22. Now, the word where we get in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Exodus, there's a translation issue. So where the Hebrew meaning for the word is harm for asan, this was translated into the Greek as form. So the Hebrew would be, if there be no harm, meaning no death in reference to the mother, then he shall be fined. Was rendered into the Greek, if there be no form, meaning no form to the fetus in the mother, then he shall be fined. Thus, it was interpreted in the Greek reception that if there was form to the fetus, then it would be a life for a life. This shifted the focus from the mother to the fetus. Later, St. Augustine formulated this as a distinction between the embryo informatus and the embryo formatus, a fetus not yet formed and one already formed. We'll return to Augustine in a little bit about how this plays out within his tradition. But it's important that even in the more strict interpretations of this interpretations of this verse, there is acknowledgement of the difference in stages of development of the fetus, and therefore abortion early in the pregnancy would not have been seen as a moral ethical issue, even in early church debates. And I'll discuss that a little bit more soon. So current claims that the moment of conception should be seen as the beginning of a protected being is extreme from not only from a biblical standpoint, but from the standpoint of Jewish and Christian traditional interpretation and rulings as well. It should also be noted that the concept of ensoulment is not an issue in Jewish tradition because the soul is considered immortal, a part of the divine that returns to the divine no matter when it enters or leaves the body. So the soul is considered to be born pure, free of the later Christian concept of the taint of original sin that Augustine champions in the late 4th and early 5th century CE, which ends up also being part of a lot of the rationale that I'll discuss on why we have this kind of issue with tradition and conflating of the Bible. So first of all, Augustine was not the first to come up with the idea of this kind of original sin piece. So as I mentioned, this is different in Jewish and Christian tradition. But it was actually started with Origen in the 2nd century, and it has these, gets further developed in Augustine's City of God, written in the early 5th century, and reveals his world that's laden with sin. And this worldview reveals a harsh outlook on the state of humanity, and this attitude extends even to innocent children. And the centrality of original sin to this worldview eventually leads to a tradition of a limbo, for instance. So all of this becomes kind of adds in senses of shame and sin into and taboo around talking about the loss of children. So Augustine, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide, but what I want to highlight is that there are no direct verses in the Hebrew Bible or in Christian scriptures that address abortion. And there are no canonical or non-canonical texts that depict Jesus speaking about abortion, and Paul also does not make mention of it in his letters. So the leaked brief from the Supreme Court, which states on page 9, the Constitution makes no express reference to the right to obtain an abortion, and therefore those who claim that it protects such a right must show that the right is somehow implicit in the constitutional text. To flip this, I would reply, the Bible, for those that want to use the Bible to justify this stance, I would reply, the Bible makes no express reference to the condemnation or restriction against abortion, and therefore those who claim that it justifies such regulation of agency must show that this regulation is somehow implied in the biblical text or in tradition. Next slide, please. So moving from the literary context, which again was just showing how it's not stated within the Hebrew Bible or Christian scriptures, historical context, which ends up being the context for where for the church fathers that that develop it further, comes with these stages of the soul. So Aristotle considered that the rational human soul only became part of the body when the fetus moved on its own accord or volition. So this comes from his treatise on the soul, which says, for the soul is itself the cause as that from which the movement is derived. Before that, he thought the fetus had a nutritive soul like a plant, then a sensitive soul like an animal, and then the rational soul, which distinguishes humans from animals in his philosophy and is the final stage of development. Augustine, again, who further developed that original concept that began in Origin, follows Aristotle's view, believing that the fetus was not a person until it develops to the point where it's a rational soul. So Augustine, in his commentary on the Septuagint, refers to the unformed fetus as a seed, a semina. He states that the human being is not destroyed when a cutting is clipped from the sprout in utero, and indicates that the sentiency is a necessary condition for a human person to be present in the womb. Hence, only in later stages of pregnancy is abortion considered homicide. Augustine reiterates the Septuagint's view discussed earlier that the destruction of a fetus could be considered killing only at a later stage of fetal development. On his commentary on Exodus, he says the law does not provide that the act, referring to abortion, pertains to homicide, for there cannot yet be said to be a live soul in a body that lacks sensation. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica also differentiated early from late abortions, which derived logically from his theory of delayed hominization, a belief that the soul entered a fetus only at a certain stage of development, which is again associated with that third stage. So these are important people within Christian tradition that are given weight. They are emblematic of many traditions within Christian traditions, and yet this aspect of their tradition has been veiled, as is one way to put it. It's been rejected in order to support this new attention to looking at protecting life at the moment of conception, which is not biologically or theologically, cannot be biologically sustained, as that life could not live on its own. And then theologically doesn't stand with the tradition, the earlier tradition. So next slide, please. So we have seen now historical conceptions of fetal development and stages of the soul, also that are not rooted in modern biology, but they did in fact result in theologies that supported what today would be considered first and early second trimester abortion, which accounts for the majority of legal abortions in the US. According to the CDC, the majority of abortions in 2019 took place early in gestation. 92.7% of abortions were performed with less than 13 weeks of gestation. A smaller number of abortions, 16.2, were performed 14 to 20 weeks of gestation, and even fewer, less than 1%, were performed at the 21 weeks or more. So that means that 99% of abortions would have been supported by the theological stances and interpretations of Jewish and Christian tradition, and again, which is not restricted within the Hebrew Bible or Christian scriptures. And then the traditional understandings of those of the scripture also would have supported these early first and early second trimester abortions. So the debate has shifted to more strict conceptions of the beginning of personhood in more recent history. So for instance, it wasn't until 1869 that the Catholic position eliminated all distinctions based on embryonic or fetal development. And the concept of hominization as immediate, which is to say that it occurs at the moment of conception, was directly in contradiction to Aquinas and Augustine. So there's a really great article by Seth Dowland that chronicles the development of evangelical thought in the 1970s on the matter and an intersection between abortion, feminism, and gay rights, and how the evangelical and the Catholic pro-life came together. in a discussion that was also rooted in an attempt to push back on segregation, the undoing of racial segregation. And there's been a lot of other resources that have recently become available due to the leaking of the draft that point to, again, how this history of coalitions and the religious dialogue around this is about more than reproductive justice, but is rooted in other dialogues of systemic oppression, primarily around race. But it's also important to know that even in a pre-Roe era in this country, that clergy have come together and to support reproductive justice. So for instance, there was a clergy consultation center service on abortion where there was more than 1,000 mostly Protestant pastors, as well as priests and rabbis in a group from 1967 that helped women seeking abortions in a pre-Roe era. And so there, even before it was legal in this country, we've seen faith leaders that haven't fit into this strict kind of pro-life kind of moral, this created moral and religious narrative, and have seen the ways in which they need to be called to help people that need anyone that needs these services. Next slide, please. So our moment now, as we're again living in this time in which a right that has been established precedent for 50 years is being threatened, is to acknowledge our embodied reality, right? So moving away from this dichotomy of pro-life and pro-choice, and acknowledging how for many, it's not a choice. So that's romanticized language that does not apply to many women. And again, that's the inclusive concept of women that truly need access to safe and legal abortions because they're in unsafe spaces. They're financially, physically, and or emotionally unable to have a true choice. They're suffering. So we have to ask the role of systemic oppression. Who is most likely to suffer for this, right? And we have learned, there's been many sources that have shown that this is going to unfairly impact those of lower socioeconomic status, as well as our BIPOC communities. The quality of life for women before, during, and after pregnancy, and the baby, as well as the children after birth, we do not have the services within this country that we need to have. So this also impacts our embodied reality and the emotional and physical and financial costs of adoption, which is currently in the leaked brief, as if adoption as well as abandonment of children is the solution, not taking into consideration the physical toll that this takes on the birthing person's body, and the emotional impact. And so that is where I call also for those that have experienced miscarriages to think empathetically about the emotional and physical pain that is in, as well as potentially the financial cost that you had to experience going through our current insurance and medical system here in the US, and just think about that being compounded. Jeannie Whitten Andrews makes a call to see Mother Mary as a Palestinian unwed Mother B to invoke empathy for modern day Marys. And many of you may have seen those images that circulate on social media around how even Mary gave consent before being impregnated. She was asked by an angel. So how does this fit in with rape and incest as the trigger, those states that have trigger laws currently, so that if this leaked draft is to become a reality, They do not have any clauses to offer services, even if in the case of rape or incest. So, as I mentioned, many of have been focused on how this the kind of having a pro-choice is a misnomer, as this is a romanticized language, because this really isn't about a choice. And we've had this opening of discussion, for instance. Jeannie Whitten-Andrews offers a call for us to move to what's called a pro-love movement, right? So a pro-love movement in being one that acknowledges the intersectionality of this, that acknowledges that this is a difficult choice, to call for empathy and love amongst us, right? To face the ways in which our systems are not supportive of our of these decisions, of these legislative decisions. As Sister Joan Critister said, there is a difference between being pro-life and pro-birth, to example. So if this is really if you're coming from a pro-life stance, having one-on-one discussions with people from that stance to talk about where are their values, and if it is in this, most would say then that they want to have that they would want to have these services available. So then why are they not pushing again for these services to be made available? So how can we look for allies that start in conversations about what are our values and what are we trying to push forward, right? So lifting up the complexity and the intersectionality of this issue and bringing up the ways in which our community doesn't support that, and how we can push forward to support that. Next slide, please. Okay, so freedom and safety and the inconsistency in policy and support. Again, so just to give you some pieces that you may hear as what's coming up in the news. So in 1973, Roe v. Wade was the constitutional right for safe and legal abortions. This was set precedent, and then this was precedent on precedent in the 1992 Casey versus Planned Parenthood institutes the concept of undue burden. So again, the Supreme Court reaffirmed Roe v. Wade as precedent. And then in 2007, Planned Parenthood versus Gonzalez, which was the so-called partial birth abortion ban. This is one of those myths that I mentioned earlier. There is no such thing as partial birth abortion. This is a vilification around what is actually happens in reproductive justice, right? So 99% of abortions that happen are in the first and in the early second trimester. And those that are going to happen later than that are for extenuating medical circumstances. So we have to move against these kind of these false narratives that are to promote to scare tactics, basically. And they've been used to support and violence against abortion clinics and the people that attend them. So I'm sure that many of you have seen the picketers, and there's also been various, unfortunately, examples of doctors and nurses and people and clinics being targeted by violence. And state restrictions fueled, these state restrictions that we see in these trigger laws have been fueled by religious claims to morality. So when we start looking at the strategies that have been employed in many of the earlier cases that have been pushing the boundaries to see where, how far these discussions can go, we see the intersectionality of these discussions, right? So if if we don't band together and find common ways of discussing this and not becoming such a polarized point, but become an actual conversation, then we're going to see our rollback of other rights that we think are firmly established. So what the call is to start thinking about the common values that we can have, moving towards a pro-love movement, thinking about how we can be pushing our legislators and through our votes. So if you know somebody that hasn't registered to vote yet, make sure that you do. Be willing to open up difficult conversation, even though it can be one of trauma and hurt, and opening up the spaces for empathy. So where is the core of the issue for each person, right? So one-on-ones to get people to look at this issue differently. Next slide, please. So yes, unfortunately, the world is an unjust place. We have to acknowledge that in order to find the ways, we have to acknowledge that in order to find ways that we can change, we can make changes in our networks. And so sometimes acknowledging the magnitude of injustice that operates from them is overwhelming. But don't give up, organize. So things can change. We have fought for our rights before, and we can do that again. We can find allies. Again, if we focus on our empathy, our own experiences, bringing that to the table, to be vulnerable in order to hopefully change minds. Next slide, please. So flipping the script requires recentering on our values. So sometimes that means having an honest conversation with yourself about what your values are. Something is not a value if you're not willing to take risks and make sacrifices for it, fight for it. If you're not currently engaged in, then this is the time to do so. So recentering on our values and creating your goals and priorities to be in alignment with those values can help align different aspects of your life in a way that can help support and sustain each other. Because no one person can create change on their own. You need to find communities that can help, they can work alongside, that will help you continue to grow. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Communities of resistance gain strength when we bring our whole being to them, sharing our talents, encouraging others to do the same by helping maintain a space that all feel welcome to share their life experience and perspective. This can inspire new approaches to issues and to gain momentum, that we can address issues and have conversations and really actively listen to one another to get to where our hesitations are, where our anger comes from. This is one of the reasons that I include this quote in my syllabi is from Audre Lorde. It says, "Without community, there is no liberation, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between an individual and her oppression. But community must not be a shedding of our differences, nor the pathetic pretense that these differences do not exist." We all have different experiences. We all have different views on this, but we need to find a space to start dialoguing with each other again. Because if we don't, then we're going to see our lives change in ways that it will be shocking to some. And we need to be able to be there to support one another as these changes happen and to fight against them. Next slide, please. So as a moment of hope, as words of hope, I say that at our acceptance speech at the National Book Foundation Medal for the National Book Foundation Medal, author Ursula Le Guin said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, very often in our art, the art of words." So again, use the platforms that you have to bring attention to the fact that, to start conversations. As Representative John Lewis tweeted on June 27, 2018, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, week, a month, or year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." And then the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote, "And where do we go from here? Freedom is not won by a passive acceptance of suffering. Freedom is won by a struggling against suffering." So again, by aligning our scholarship with our values, we contribute to actively creating change. And this is important right now because with the increased severity of various laws around reproductive justice here in the US, it's important to be able to identify not only the historical and theological hypocrisy of certain claims to tradition and scriptural authority, which have constructed a false sense of moral high ground, but also to peel back these excuses and redirect ones that get to the core of the issue, which is about our agency and our transformative power that we have when we come together. Next slide, please. So lastly, Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman's poem, "The Hill We Climb," that she performed at President Biden's swearing-in ceremony, reminds us that hope is not naive. Resilient hope requires bravery. And flip scripts offer a corrective, not idealistic wishful thinking. So I feel that women's studies and religion empowers all of us to be able to bring our full selves to the table, to share our stories, to inspire empathy, to inspire dialogue, to break down the dichotomies and the dualisms, to break down the ways in which we keep people as others and to see each other as community, to see ourselves as linked, as connected. And so this is not one contingent of people's problem. This is all of our problem. This is a threat to not just one contingent of people's rights, but to all of our rights, right? So, and I think that women's studies and religion ends up being the space that can hold that type of conversation, can hold that type of pain and transform it into resilient hope, can inspire bravery, can inspire dialogue. So I hope that made sense. I'm sorry, I brought a lot of emotion and myself to this. And again, it wasn't my original plan for the lecture, but I felt that this is the space in which I needed to be. I need to practice what I teach. So thank you all, and I will open up for discussion all together. So if anyone has any questions or anything that they would like to share or ask, and also it's okay for that to it was very heavy, and to just let that sit. And also I'm unsure about how clear, but if anybody would, you are welcome to contact me if you'd like further resources on any of those components. And we can also just have an opening of discussion and community that's of active listening and about just the wider field of women's studies and religion, and doesn't have to be about this particular topic. So just invite that. Okay. Yes, Cynthia, Dr. Cynthia Molabita. Can't see everybody's. There we go. I think you have to be unmuted. There we go. Oh.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Bacchi, I'm not going to say something substantive right now. I just want to say I think that was a brilliant lecture. And I think it was brilliant because of the way you delivered it by setting out your framework first and then actually enacting the framework that you set out. And I think it was also brilliant because it related the work on ancient texts to the way we need to demystify and counter what's going on right now with the threat to Roe versus Wade. And then finally, the content that you gave was just marvelously useful. And I really, really do hope that this lecture is going to be made available and also publicized so that more people can have access to it. It was just really brilliantly done. So big time appreciation to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, this will be publicly available on the GTU WSR YouTube playlist after. Yes, so I see Vanessa Fox has put a question in the chat, which is, would you please give an example of idolatry as it relates to abortion, Bacchi? So this is, I'm thinking off the top of my head. So this is related to, in some conservative circles, that'll take snippets of verses that are related to for instance, there are prohibitions around, this also ties into the into quotes that are used against homosexuality, that by certain groups, and that again in the ancient world it's very complicated because they're not working with the same concept, with the same format of sexuality as a modern sexuality, right? So it's a homosocial environment, and heterosexual and homosexual aren't paradigms that are working with. So I'm blanking right this moment on an example of how idolatry is used, but it's mostly in the debates of around the prohibition for I'm sorry. I'm a little bit I'm a little bit I went over vulnerable, to be honest, with this whole as I mentioned, I hadn't actually told, there's only just a small amount of people that I had talked about my my experience with, and so I'm a little bit I kind of pushed through the lecture and now my head is a blank. But Vanessa, I will email you some resources about that when I have my head a bit straight. And also I am planning on putting together a handout that will be added to this YouTube lecture that will, when it's posted to YouTube, that will have resources as well. And so I'll make sure that there are some resources that speak to that specifically, since I'm currently, my head is a blank. So I apologize for that. Yes, and Dr. Cynthia. Yes, and Laura, and oh, I think we have to do this. Do I do this?
Right. Okay. Hi there.
I couldn't get myself unmuted. I want to say you don't need to apologize for that, Bacchi, because I honestly think for you to have been willing to share yourself and your life for the purpose of other people's healing and freedom and capacity for vulnerability, and choosing to be vulnerable in the way that you did, to the extent that it would keep your mind, which is so smart, your particular mind is so smart, to the extent that it would keep it from being able to respond to a question that you normally would respond to very readily. I think that's very moving and courageous. It's countercultural in the academy completely. It's it's anti-white supremacist. It's anti-perfection. It's daring yourself to be present and real, even if it's going to diffuse your capacity to show off your brilliant mind. So I don't think it's to be apologized for at all. I think it's admirable.
Thank you. Thank
Mhm.
you very much for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Laura? Oh, I have to do that.
Let me,
There
there
you
we go. Well, I wanted to say that, yes, very similar thought, that we can only take from everything that you just have been so gracious and generous and giving of yourself. That's just, we can only imagine the situation that all women find themselves in when they're in that position. How emotionally, how difficult it is to take care of yourself emotionally, how off-centering it is, and that you were an example of that is just a reminder that this is exactly the issue that we're talking about. This is the the voice that's taken away from women during these times because they are so vulnerable. They can't speak up, and then their healing process, and then the healing process is so long. And that's always a reminder. Healing is a very long time with these issues, and thank you for being an example of that. Like I'm so glad it's being talked about. I'm proud to have been a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for, I feel that the women's studies, again, this isn't something that it hasn't been something that that I have shared because it is so painful to me, and I am still really grappling with it but I felt that I knew that this would be a safe space, although I know that afterwards when it's available, it no longer potentially is. But I also just felt that it's something that I had to use this platform and space to discuss, especially because I've been hearing so much of it's okay for there's some complicity, there's some feeling of safety that happens in states that we think of as the progressive, the safe haven states. And it's not the same all across even safe haven states. And so you can't just assume that you're going to be safe anywhere that you are. And it's not just about this issue, right? And it impacts so much, it opens up the space for so many other ways in which this ruling and precedent can be enacted to take away rights. And so we have to stay ever vigilant, and we have to, my call to action is, to rile people up to vote, to make sure if you make sure you're registered to vote, make sure that the people that you know are registered to vote, and to be able to, to have, I hope that you'll have that call for empathy and to have like real conversations, one-on-one conversations with people that maybe you're not sure how they feel about it, or you do know how they feel about it, and to try to come together to get back to the values that you share, which are ultimately about changing our society to be more just and inclusive and safe, right? And so I'm hoping that it can be reframed and we can break those dichotomies and those dualisms that I see Dr. Valerie and
Bacchi, I just wanted to also chime in and thank you. I think I was one of the first ones who put in the chat thanking you for your courage in as you were talking in sharing your narrative, and that there's power in narratives, in the realities of our stories. And so your courage in opening up your talk with an example for the reasons you stated of people assuming that wouldn't happen in California, and or to someone like you or like us, you know, really was a powerful wake up and aha moment for us to then hone in on what else you had to say. I would encourage you, there's just two things I wanted to share. I would encourage you, whether or not you choose to share your personal story in writing, just the value and brilliance of the rest of the information that you shared, and the way that you approach the text, the Hebrew and gospel text, to show some of those interpretive licenses that are erroneous, and to talk about where some of those came from, would be a very, very meaningful journal article and contribution to the pedagogy and the vocation. So one place I would really encourage you to consider and talk to them about this is the Journal on Theological Pedagogy and Religion that Dr. Jennifer Davidson and Dr. Kyle Seiferlein edit, because this is those approaches and incorporating Augustine and all of that is something that the wider academy and religious circles need to have some articulation to begin talking about. So I would encourage you to put it in writing. And again, I say, whether or not you include to open up with your own story, that's powerful and validates, but it's again, how you feel and when you're ready. The second and last thing I have to say, that while you were talking and sharing some of those slides, I do this for my church often. I took screenshots, so including you lecturing. So I want to share those with you so that hopefully Women's Studies can use those on our PowerPoint page and in promotions, and you yourself can share them with others. So thank you. I really, really appreciate your voice and the pedagogical suggestions that you gave.
Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I have to say, you know, I have those suggested resources on the things, and everything that I've said, it's not, I'm just putting it together, and it's been written, but I do hear what you're saying about putting it together and having those resources then in something that can be applied, especially within that pedagogical lens, and would be valuable. But I also don't want to take credit for, I'm not the first in any way to be bringing all this in.
You are making a stance and raising up the hypocrisies, and so that's the premise of your argument and your stance, and those other citations and things that you're using or referencing is part of the validation, but your voice has done this, so don't negate the brilliance of what you've just done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for oh yes, I see Sharon.
I'd kind of like to repeat what Dr. Miles Tribble just said, or just appreciate that. I mean, I've had your class where you presented some of this material before about where abortion, or where the scriptures did not mention abortion. That really helped me. And someone mentioned earlier that it takes a long time to heal from these things. And so I just wanted to say that I was in the position that you were in, Bacchi. Many years ago, I was married to a Catholic. I had 2 previous pregnancies that were normal, and then I had another one. And this is a second marriage to this man that I was just now pregnant by. and it wasn't with my consent. But I went through the same thing that you did, knowing how terrible it was with all the religious guilt that I had. And he was a Catholic, I'm not. But he just loaded me with the Catholic guilt around that. And we went 12 weeks, and I was miscarrying tissue and stuff that was not normal. I knew that I couldn't carry this. I could not make the decision to have an abortion. And finally, he made the decision. And what I realized then was the power of narrative stories, when you're telling your story, or I'm telling mine, is to put a face on this issue rather than having the megalith of society saying that women's bodies are just something here to produce children, to pleasure men, and to continue the legacy of the population that's encouraged by the Bible, etc. When we hear these stories, we can realize that individuals have different stories, and they're all different, but we all, as human beings, should have the right to regulate our own bodies and make our own decisions. And in my case, when my husband made the decision, as a staunch Catholic, I realized that he was very much against abortion until it happened to him, until he saw what I was going through, until he saw and had to think about the impact of the rest of our lives together, that it changed his whole viewpoint. So by telling our stories, as personal as they are, as painful as they are, other women can come forward and realize that there's help, there's camaraderie amongst the sisters who've gone through this, that they're not alone, that they're not wrong, and they can reach out. And in my case, afterwards, the whole thing, our marriage fell apart, but he used this abortion against me as a spontaneous abortion to say that it happened because I didn't want to carry his child. So there's another area right in there that women have to deal with about what our bodies are made for, is that we're human beings, we're autonomous, and should be in our own lifestyle. So I just wanted to appreciate the scripture that you gave us, because all these years later, when I see that again, I realize that the religious baggage that was dumped on me was just his version, or his church's version, when it isn't rooted in anything actual. So thank you for sharing that. And I also just want to say that by sharing the stories is really helping all of us as women, as human beings, to find that camaraderie and strength we need to help each other. We're now seeing other women, powerful women, coming forward and telling their stories, and I just want to encourage more women to do so, because it helps us be more human, and it puts a face on an issue that we really need to see, like the AIDS issues did, like other issues have done, Alzheimer's, etc. When you see a face on it, then we can impact each other and change our cultures for the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sharon. Yes, and I think I feel that, as I said before, before my experience, I was, I was pro-choice, and I felt that I already was, firmly in that fight. And then having experienced what I experienced, just the immensity of the empathy and compassion and that I now feel, it's personal. Like now, when I see those picketers, when I know like the way in which I was treated, especially as I don't have the last name of my partner, the way in which my medical records were handled, the way in these intrusive exams that I was put through, thinking about that treatment, and so and it's something, miscarriage is just, it's so common. And so I think that there are so many allies out there that don't think of themselves necessarily as allies. We've created a boundary in between, as a miscarriage is something different, and that gets to that kind of romanticizing around choice. I didn't have a choice to have a miscarriage, right? Women that are faced with so many intersectional oppressions don't feel that they don't have a choice either. It's not even about feeling like you have a choice. They don't have a choice, right? And there's pain there. There's pain in that lack of choice. There's anger. And we should be able to come together as allies of there are things that are beyond our control. right? And in the case of abortion, some of those things, if we really want to address it, and because there are systems of oppression that we can overturn to create different circumstances, right? So if we get back to our values, if that's what we want to go to, then where are the things that we can change? How can we mobilize to push for that? So I call for, again, that empathy, and for listening, and for us to remember that we do have strength to change if we come together. So please, again, vote, help people register to vote, and have conversations, be open to difficult emotional conversations. We all want transformation, I think. So let's move for it. So thank you so much. Thank you for spending the evening together. Thank you for holding me in this space, and my gratitude to all of you, and thank you.